And welcome. I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. It's a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. And you can also stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely, stimulating topics distinguished by high level content and technical excellence. And in this episode, we welcome Amiee Allison, who is the founder and president of She the People, a national organization dedicated to elevating the voice and the power of women of color. In 2019, she organized and moderated the nation's first presidential forum for women of color, and her work has been featured across national and international media outlets, including in Politico, the New York Times, PBS, and MSNBC. And she just returned from a trip to Africa, and she holds a BA and MA from Stanford. And I welcome Amiee Allison to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Delighted to have you.
I'm so happy to be back together again.
Yeah, here we are, a team of many years. In fact, I always enjoy talking to you. And now is such an auspicious time for you because you've dedicated so much of your life professionally and passionately to bringing women of color into political positions and into political roles and getting the voters out and so forth. And now someone who you've known for years, and your roots are in Oakland and so are hers in many respects. Kamala Harris has become the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party in the United States. You must be over the moon.
I'm over the moon, and I'm also both trying to experience the moment and have some reflection about how we got here and what it means for us all. When I started the organization She the People, it was to hold the first ever Women of Color political summit in San Francisco. And it was on the heels of a time in 2016, the presidential election, and then a number of special elections that happened afterwards in which Black women and other women of color, although were so significant in terms of organizing voters and actually the vote themselves, particularly in the South and Southwest or states like California where I live, but not being recognized, not by the Democrats or the Republicans, really. And the mission was for us to be seen and heard. And in those years in between, we had more women of color from communities that hadn't been represented in Congress or in the State House running successfully in primaries and general elections. But in my wildest dreams, I didn't think that Kamala Harris, who is from my hometown, Oakland, California, who rose to statewide leadership in California and then in the Senate, and we supported her there, who had a presidential campaign that kicked off and then ended after a few months. I was one of the folks in my organization advocating. Look, we made the case. You have women of color in nationally, but in swing states that are some 25% of the electorate, and we don't just want to carry the weight for the rest of the Democrats. We actually want our leadership reflected, and we want to be supported. So we made the case in a lot of different ways for then presidential candidate Biden to have a Black woman, a woman of color on the ticket. And although it's not talked about now, it was one of the reasons that we eked out a victory in Georgia, which the success of that campaign back in 2020 depended on Georgia.
And
so
Stacey
here we
Abrams and Jim Clyburn, I mean, there were certainly major figures who you allied yourself with and who now,
Yeah.
It's true, in fact, that I remember reading an article you did back in Newsweek about the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and you were talking about how things looked pretty auspicious. I mean, and you look at the trajectory of his having not only taken on a vice presidential running mate, but also putting a Black woman on the Supreme Court, also having a Black woman as his press secretary. I mean, he really, in that sense, came through for black women, but they came through for him.
Yeah, and really, this is new territory for those of us who work in electoral politics, in the sense that you got a group of people. Let's just take black women as a subset of women of color. Black people are 25% of Democratic voters. That's incredible considering our smaller population. So we over-index as Democrats. Black women over-index, turn out at a higher rate than in almost every election than any other race and gender. And we've only had access to the ballot box in '65, the Voting Rights Act, where our voting rights were protected. And you have a situation where black women had been the key organizers, turning out communities and networks to vote, which is key. And we'd done that largely unacknowledged. And when I started this work, I looked at black women who were trying to run for statewide office, people like Stacey Abrams, or who were running for, Congress or, Senate, and they would often be taken out in primaries by the Democrats, fellow Democrats, a number of ways, 100 different ways, and not supported for leadership. So this new acknowledgement, and it is fairly new in our political culture, that black women are a political force. You want to have black women on your side, that you got to have them in leadership and highly visible, that they can win primaries. All of this is really in the last 6 years that we've seen the possibilities there.
That's pretty new, yeah. I'm going to ask you a question. It may sound like a bit of an offbeat question, but I remember an interview I did years ago with Emily's List, which is an organization, for those who aren't familiar with it, which supports women in politics and has a good deal of funding and gets into races that are involved with just women in general. Now we're talking about, with respect to Amiee Allison, women of color. And I remember asking the head of Emily's List, would you support a conservative candidate who's a woman? And I'll ask you the same question. Would you consider supporting a conservative candidate who happens to be a woman of color, especially if she were running against, let's say, a so-called liberal or progressive candidate who is not of color?
It's interesting because my work is not, although we're aligned with a lot of Democratic Party members that run for higher office, we're not a functionary of the Democratic Party. And the reality is a lot of women of color, and again, I have to say, it is Black plus Latina, Asian American, Muslim, Native women. When they register to vote, they're registering decline to state. They don't have a party. And so we can't be aligned only with a party. We have to recognize that there is no one way of thinking. There's a range amongst all the groups. Even among black women, there's a range from
But forgive me, there's a disproportionate number, as you said before, that are members of
That's right.
the Democratic Party. So if you have, let's say, a Republican who's a black woman or a woman of color, of any color, does she not get your support if she's a Republican?
I love this question because I think for Emily's List and a lot of us who support women, the question about which women deserve our support and get our backing is valid. And the thing I want to say is we evolve in our movement. The women of color movement that I envisioned was never about only representation. And I gotta bring people along with this because it's about values. So we always said here, women of color are on the outs. Despite being highly visible, the Oprahs, the Olympic champions, that we're Beyonce. You have some notable exceptions, but the vast majority of women of color are on the low end of economic and social measures. We know what it's like to be on the outs, and it has it's made most people who identify with women of color, which is not everybody, but identifies women of color, supporters of a certain kind of politics that supports racial, gender, and economic justice. So having said that, those are the candidates, those are the leaders that we get the most support for women of color, behind women of color. And right now, with the state of the Republican Party, you know, there are a few women of color that are members of places like Florida and places like Arizona, but they're not embracing justice issues that appeal to the vast majority of women of color. They're not transformative candidates. They're not leaders that recommend different, kind of a set of policies that would address the biggest pain points for most women of color. So we don't spend our time there right now. But I'm hoping, I mean, the dream for me would be to evolve our political culture and our political system so there's actually more than two parties and there are lots of places that people can be, and then we can evolve the kind of people that get our supporting and backing.
Well, I want to talk with you about the presidential race, but before we get there, since you talk about many parties, it's interesting to note, I don't want to get too local here, but the cover story in the San Francisco Chronicle is that Mayor London Breed, who is an African-American, is now thought to be in the lead. The polls surprised everybody. It's going to be, a vote based on splitting the vote, of course. But, she actually has the numbers, and that surprised a lot of people. You've got black women in roles as mayors. You've got black women who are, moving forward in ways that had, at one time, perhaps less than 6 years ago, would not have been imagined. It's all really pretty positive. And here it brings us, I guess, back to Kamala Harris. But before we get there, I want to get your reaction to the Cori Bush defeat in the primary, which many have blamed on AIPAC, which spent more money than probably has ever been spent maybe in a primary race. And she was defeated because she was perceived as an enemy of Israel and was the first to call for a ceasefire. And she has come back really very strongly and said, I'm going to get you, AIPAC, or words to that effect. But I'm wondering how this plays out in your mind. It's so current. It's not as current as the presidential race, but it has a lot of impact. When you think about Bowman, for example, also losing a race in Queens for the same reason. But it was very strategic of AIPAC because they brought out other things like the fire alarm that Jordan Bowman set off, which was, absurd from many people's perspective. And they brought up strategic things like Cori Bush voting against the infrastructure bill. In other words, it was AIPAC money, certainly, that had a great deal to do with it, but AIPAC is very strategic and political. And so I'm getting around to the question here, which is your response to these defeats. And maybe, Summer Lee, members of the squad are being targeted by AIPAC.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass said it best, power concedes nothing without a struggle. So electoral politics in terms of building power for women of color is one avenue. And the reason I say that is because there was something incredible when Cori Bush won, because she isn't just a person who's an incredible leader, who talks about love, who has her personal witness about being, having insecure housing and being homeless and living in her car. And she's not just a person who will call out AIPAC's role. And, they were always behind the scenes, but they never got put on Front Street quite the same way as now. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And it wasn't just that. It was that this pastor, this nurse, this leader is in the movement. She emerged in the St. Louis area as a leader from the Black Lives Matter movement, as a direct result of the young man being shot by police. It's actually 10 years to the day that happened. And she emerged as a leader in the movement, and to have movement leaders in Congress is it's an incredible opportunity for people, not just in her district, but to have somebody who's vocalizing and not being who's pushing the boundaries of both our imagination about what's possible, but telling the truth. But it also puts a target on her back. And so her loss this week is a real travesty. One, because AIPAC has the interests of a foreign country first, and they're operating very deeply in American electoral politics in ways that most people don't fully appreciate and see. And they should not have that kind of power to defeat a leader like that. And I look at a defeat like this with a leader. Every generation's got a leader who's willing to sacrifice and take the hits in order to hold the space. Maybe it's not for her, but for other people. And you got around her a movement that's been clamoring for the U.S. to change its policy of funding Israel's war in the occupied territories and in Gaza in particular. She's not the only one. So she became this fulcrum and this such an important spokesperson for movement in her place in Congress. And I think what AIPAC was hoping for in the defeat, and remember, Wesley Bell, is the DA, the local DA that
and in many
beat
ways
her.
a credible opponent as far as
Right.
the
Okay.
candidate.
He's more of a more mainstream Democrat.
Exactly.
He plays those games. Also playing a little bit of the this kind of politics based on identitarian they would call it, but identity politics in the sense that he's a black man. So if you support a black man defeating this black woman, you think, well, on balance, they're both Democrats. Isn't it basically the same? But it couldn't be more different. So she's, I think they were hoping to stop a person like her or the movement having such a big platform. But I think what AIPAC is going to realize is that the space that Corey's leadership opened up is not lost on the next generation of people that are running for office. It's like sticking their finger in a dam. There's going to be more people who look at electoral politics as one of many possible avenues to get things done in the country. So I'm saying all that to say
You're
I've
looking at it
faced
through a
some.
hopeful lens, is what you're doing.
It's I guess now that I'm in my mid 50s and I've been through a lot of election cycles in which excellent leaders who were so needed and so connected to millions of people. They were really saying, and what a lot of people needed to be said, and advocating for people who never got a voice, who were defeated electorally. And my message to people like that is, we'll see you next time, next cycle. We find ways to build power in other ways. Because like this generation, it was like Cory Bush. The last generation was Cynthia McKinney. There's all these like amazing people that I have seen defeated that inspire the generation, or they come back. So yeah, I'm looking at it as not the end of the story.
No, you have a guarded optimism, which is really refreshing in many ways. I want to go to some questions that are coming in, but before I do, I'm also prompted to ask you about your response to, you were talking about identity politics. Former President Donald Trump sitting in front of black journalists and opining that Kamala Harris never really determined her identity as Indian or black in terms of her ancestry, which is about as far from the truth as I can imagine. I mean, particularly for someone who strongly took pride in both sides of, I mean, I know her like you for many years, and this was not something she kept hidden or concealed in any way. And she was a member of a black sorority at Howard University, and she had strong identity on both. Her father was less of a figure in her life. Her mother was a main figure in her life in many ways, but the reality was she identified with both ancestries. I think that's pretty consistent with the way you see things. So what's your response to Trump saying, of all things, she wasn't black, or she didn't appear to be black, or whatever it was he was saying?
Well, some people said, well, he doesn't understand. You can be more than one thing. I mean, we live in the Bay Area. I'm more than one thing. My mom's white, my dad's black, and I'm both. And in that both and identity, there's a lot of room in a culture that's increasingly intersectional. We have, people could say, Trump didn't understand, but I say it's something more, nefarious, which is that he understands that he's signaling to his base, largely white people, that listen, if I can't if I can't define her race, then she can't define herself. And I'm just telling you, she is, kind of going way back in the old history of the U.S. around identity being facilitated through white lens and understanding. That's deeply racist. And so here, what we say is like, okay, what he said was deeply racist. He's not only out of touch with who is in the U.S. right now, but the thing he was trying to do, which is divide and conquer, it just had it almost, it worked against him, actually. It didn't work for him. And there were a lot of black people, and there are some black people who are like, okay, black people, and you have to define yourself fully as black. But even for those people were so offended by what he said that it didn't build any support amongst anyone. It just made him look like an idiot.
Well, it was also sort of like saying Barack Obama isn't really an American, and maybe Kamala Harris isn't really black in the way black should be defined. But this is ironically said in front of a lot of black journalists who had a very strong reaction. And
if anything, he solidified and maximized black support for Kamala Harris, because being black in the U.S. is a whole range of things. And the amazing power of identification with blackness, American blackness, is partly because we had to, the one drop will make you whole type, that harkens back from slavery times, but also because the identity is so expansive. You can be black plus other things, and there's room in our culture for that. And so he was kind of taking a shot at something that is deeply important to us as black people. You're not going to get away with it. And remember that, all he had to say was that, if you wanted to soften black support for Kamala Harris, he should have said something else. But if he said that, he hardened it. Even amongst a lot of black Republicans friends telling me, yeah, I wasn't sure, and now I'm sure. I'm going to vote for her.
It's a pretty odd way to conduct a campaign, but going to Georgia, for example, where you worked with Stacey Abrams, and I want to talk with you a bit about that. He attacks the governor of Georgia, who's a fellow Republican, and you wonder, is this the way he's doing a campaign? Is this to the best of his advantage and so forth? It's just maybe like was said by the governor of Minnesota, now the running mate for Kamala Harris. It's just pretty weird. I do want to get some questions in here. They're coming in here, but I wanted to also ask you about Georgia, because there was some sense that maybe that election was rigged. At least those were the charges that were made when Stacey Abrams was not elected as governor. And Trump has been certainly criticized appropriately for saying that his loss of an election was rigged. And I'm still trying to kind of get my head around. I wonder how you see this, about how those two things maybe mirror each other in some ways, or appear to mirror each other. I mean, is one accusation absolutely wrong and the other is absolutely right? How do you see it?
I mean, I can tell you what I saw.
Yeah.
I saw over a number of years, Stacey Abrams, through an organization called in Georgia, New Georgia Project, identify and register historic numbers of people of color and send those registrations in. And I think even in like 2014, I went to the Capitol in Georgia, where they were throwing out registrations, like 30, 40,000. They were not adding up to the voter rolls. So it was kind of like a Cold War of who was going to be able to get their voters registered and those voters to stay on the rolls. I saw in 2018, when Stacey Abrams ran in the primary, the incredible lines in places where Black, Latino, and Asian Americans lived, which is Cobb County and Gwinnett County. And just one of the tricks is to not put enough machines, so that people stand in line, and they, not allow people to get water or food while they're standing in line 8 hours. So that's what I witnessed with my own eyes. I know that the Republicans, who both Kemp was responsible for, and the people at the county level, there was a lot of corruption and keeping people who had a legitimate legal right to vote from their votes counting. And so that's one thing. And despite all of that, when it came to the vote later, the one that Trump is talking about, where you had a special election and this runoff election and then this incredible high turnout in Georgia, the result was pretty decisive. So for him to claim, despite all of the tricks the Republicans had made to make it difficult for people of color to vote, that they won, for him to claim after the fact that it wasn't legitimate was a lie. And since so much depends on the results of the vote in Georgia, he used that, as well as places like Arizona's vote, as the reasons to say he shouldn't be leaving the White House. I see what you mean, because I suspect that we're going to be facing similar challenges this year. I just like President Biden had alluded to in a recent interview. I worry about accusations and violence after the results of the election, no matter what the election is in Georgia. So it's one thing that I know people are trying to both prepare for and to do what they can by, there's an organization, Fair Fight, who's been deeply helping people to understand what is happening behind the scenes, who's responsible for counting the ballots, the changes that the state legislature had made, and how they're fighting back legally and through other challenges.
I think we can also say with some certainty that if Donald Trump loses this election, he will say, whatever the circumstances, it was rigged, and it may kick up a lot of problems. So I welcome your thoughts about really being prepared for that, because we need to be. Let me go to some questions. Phil from Washington, D.C., and by the way, we welcome your questions for our guest, Amiee Allison. Phil says, you recently went to Africa. Did you visit Rwanda? Women represent over 60% of the Chamber of Deputies. What are they doing that isn't happening here? Thanks.
That's such a good question. That's a really good question. I didn't make it to Rwanda. I mean, I went to West Africa for the first time in my life just a couple of months ago, in Ghana and Accra. And my 23andMe tells me my people are from there, which was amazing. And just a side note, Black Americans were often told we come from basically nothing, or that our American story starts on the bottom of a slave ship. So to go to the land, to see the trees and the blue water, to see the places that my ancestors, 14 generations back, came from was remarkable and transformative. In terms of modern day Africa, we could say, we could look at that, we could look at Iceland, we could look at a lot of places in the world in which there isn't the American style prejudice against women's leadership that we are facing now. There's a system of patriarchy baked into our political system that makes it difficult for us to even reach parity. So, they're doing something right. It has to do probably with political systems that were established not 250 years ago like ours, or almost 250 years ago, but more recently, as places like Rwanda had thrown off the yoke of colonialism, and in a place like South Africa, for example, wrote constitution and political norms baked in that were far more egalitarian across race and other things.
Didn't Rwanda also have the opportunity of reinventing itself after?
That's
all
right.
After
That's right.
Civil War. Yeah.
That's right, and I think that's another very important point. So what they did right is they have governments and structures based on modern more evolved thinking about the equality between the sexes. And as we come up on the 250th anniversary of the US, this is the time for us to call the question. What are the structures that impede true parity between the sexes in terms of leadership? It isn't that we have a lack of leadership. Look at how amazing Kamala Harris is. She is rocking the house and she is exciting millions of people. And here's a woman and a woman of color in a class that this country was built to exclude. And there's so much more political talent if we change some of the structures, and we learn from countries like Rwanda.
You want to hear a listener who has, shall we say, not such favorable feelings about Kamala and get your response? This is Jerry from Aurora. He says, are you over the moon that Kamala set up a fund for rioters and arsonists in Minneapolis, or that she claimed Justice Smollett was the victim of modern-day lynching, or that, that's Jussie Smollett, or that she claimed border officials were whipping migrants and engaging in slavery? Well, these are the kinds of things that are probably going to come up in the counter from the other side and so forth, and there are many others that will as well. But how do you address those?
I don't think you're going to get 100% of the people to support any public official. You're just not. I think what was important, and I really took this to heart, when Kamala Harris, she introduced her running mate, Tim Walz, a few days back, she made the point to say, I'm running for president. We are running to be, the president, vice president of all Americans. And the problem with, or the challenge that we all have right now, is we have a political culture and a broader culture that is so, I wouldn't say bifurcated, it's just in conflict and doesn't really look at political conversations and policy as the main driver of change right now. So we're gonna find people that say, well, I'm not going to listen to this person. I'm not going to support that person, as is your right in a democracy. So I'm over the moon that people like me, and there's millions of people like me who want, a future that's brighter. I mean, some of the concrete criticisms, like for example, in Minneapolis, I think the choice of Tim Walz was brilliant for many reasons. For Kamala Harris to choose a running mate like that, one of the things that he did in that difficult period a few years ago, of the protests after the murder of George Floyd, is that the DA was taking, I think, 3-4 days to charge the officer who we all saw murder George Floyd. And he gave the case to the state's attorney general, Allison, who was a Black Muslim, actually, who made sure that officer was held accountable and went to jail. And it was a very powerful move. And remember, a lot of governors had not handled things well. So it's okay to criticize Kamala Harris. Nobody's perfect. And
no, forgive me, Walz has been criticized too, because there was about $50 million worth of damage and 3 deaths. And, what you're hearing from the right is he didn't take a strong enough role. But you're hearing Kamala being criticized on many fronts. And it's just part of, the polarization, as you said earlier. But I just wonder, for example, about the criticism that's come down about her in terms of mistreatment of people who worked under her. Because I'm one of those people who look at people and judge people on the basis of, and I know Kamala for many years and actually have fond feelings about her. But
I actually feel really strongly about this one because I have seen so often, particularly when it comes to Black women leadership, the criticism is in several categories, and one of the top is they're difficult. They're so difficult. I want people to think about a guy.
Well, they said the same thing about Dianne Feinstein. Excuse me, Amy.
Difficult. They're so difficult. Yeah. Executives, if you think about some guy who's an executive, these are not, pick-me's. They're not like friendly, people with poor boundaries. They're driven. This is what we're going to do together. This is what I need. So when it comes from a woman, particularly a Black woman, it's considered something negative, but that is the nature of being an executive. That just is. And I think as we evolve as a culture, we're going to see, like, women have to be judged at the same level as men. And right now we're being harshly judged for the very thing that we need to be successful. You can't have a president or a vice president or a senator that's not clear with the staff and the people that work for what needs to be done. That's just how it is.
But there were reports, for example, we don't necessarily need to drill down on this, but reports of her. There was a young man, for example, who was an intern, and his father was a liberal Democrat, and they were both liberal Democrats. They were thrilled that she was an intern, and the stories came out that she insisted on not making eye contact with people, and they had to call her general when she was attorney general. These kinds of stories come around, and you can laugh at them, but you wonder, why are they there, and why are they surfacing to such a degree? Is it misogyny, or is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, it's misogyny because how are women socialized to act, and how are we socialized to expect behavior from women? So I'm not sure about this intern. I don't know about that story, but I can say that more than 10 of campaigns that I've worked with, I've heard the same accusation leveled against Black women leaders, and I think that's why it's being brought up.
Is it, if it's misogyny, is it an accusation you hear against other women of color, whether they're of Asian background or Latinas or?
That's something? A good question. Mostly it's Black women that I've supported over the years.
Are those perhaps some of those tropes about Black women that?
Yeah, I think so. There's a trope about, angry Black woman.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with being angry, okay?
No,
but
in fact, sometimes very effective. Right?
Sometimes anger's effective, but the way that the culture kind of flattens us into, anger being this kind of guttural response as opposed to strategic, as opposed to negotiating, as opposed to all these other things that good leaders do. But when you call someone an angry Black woman, you're minimizing them and their capacities, and showing, trying to suggest that they don't have the mind or the personality for leadership, and it's an old tired trope. Tired of it.
It's as tired a trope as that one about the passivity of Black women. I mean, how can you be both angry and indignant on the one hand and passive to an extreme on the other? I've got a question here I think you'll really like from Liz in Houston, Texas, and thank you for the question, Liz. She says, what can we do, we I presume means all of us, to prepare Black girls to become our next leaders?
Well, we have to make sure that they see the amazing Black women who, whether they win elections or not, whether they're leading organizations or corporate life, they get to see examples of that, even meet them, go to events where they hear people talk, and start expanding their ideas about what could be possible in their own life. We shouldn't underestimate the impact of seeing examples. It certainly had a big impact on me, and I know for that next generation.
Who were your examples?
Well, I've mentioned Cynthia McKinney, but if I really go back, it's Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee's our outgoing congresswoman who most recently ran for Senate in California.
Member of Congress to vote against the Iraq War initially.
Yeah. I met her when I was in the military myself and was applying for an honorable discharge as a conscientious objector. I met her in her office talking about service and love of our country and what does it mean when we want to fight for peace and justice. And you have to remember Barbara Lee came from movement. And I said that about Cori Bush because I think Cori Bush is a Barbara Lee leader. But Barbara Lee came from organizing the Black Panthers. She had the experience of being a low-income single mom.
And then she tied her fate to Ron Dellums, really, didn't she?
She tied her fate to Ron Dellums, but she entered politics from her hero and mine, Shirley Chisholm. So I never met Shirley Chisholm personally. She died in the 80s when I was still in high school. But Shirley Chisholm came to Mills College where Barbara Lee was taking classes, and then encouraged her to, Barbara Lee at the time said, I don't want to, voting is for punks, I don't want to do that, and convinced her not only to register to vote, but she joined Shirley Chisholm's historic campaign as the first woman to run, first Democrat to run for president. And it was bold at the time. It was, before her time. But the fact that I met and worked with and was able to support and be influenced by Barbara Lee, who had so many justice issues. She had so much courage, as you mentioned. And her life and example meant a big deal to me. So for the person who's asking, what do we do for young people? Put them in places where they can meet. They can meet people who, no matter what story they're told about themselves, are going to go for it. If they have a mission and they want to serve the community or serve the country or the world, show them what it looks like. And then when they're ready to do it, support them.
Also helps to encourage them to work on the local level on issues, doesn't it? I mean,
I think
to
so.
really be involved in the community.
I think
as
so.
much as possible. I think I've seen young people grow and adapt to that. You mentioned your military service. I discovered that you wrote a book with David Solnit, Rebecca Solnit's brother, back in 2007, called Army of None, which I guess was, was a book, kind of an anti-military book for someone who was in the military.
Yeah, and my story is I joined the Army Reserves, and it was my experience really working with veterans in the Army hospital, because my job was combat medic. That was my MOS. So I had, I was assigned to a VA, and I worked with a lot of veterans, and I saw when someone gives everything to the war machine, what happens to them afterwards. And these people are poor. These people lost parts of their body, their spirit, their soul, and I think for the young me, it opened up my eyes to a larger system of war and militarism. And, I think by the time I earned a very rare honorably discharged as a conscientious objector from Army after 6 years of service, I'd wished someone had told me as a young woman what the recruiters who are on a lot of campuses, what the reality is, so that they could have more information. So I wrote that book with that in mind. David Solnit, he's really famous for these protests. He's like these big puppets and these big organizing. They did all this work in Seattle. For me, I partnered with him because the movement, and at that time it was a growing movement that included parents and community members and teachers and students themselves, to say, how do we get more information to young people, so when recruiters who often have unchecked access to young people, to their records and things like that, when they come and they make the case to join the military, you should know what you're doing. Like for me, I really did not understand. I had a recruiter that he was on my campus at Antioch High School back in the 80s, and he said, hey, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be a doctor. Great. You can join the reserves. It'll help you to get into medical school. And he gave me the impression that I wasn't going to carry a weapon. So imagine my surprise when I got off the bus in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and we were ordered to stand in formation out on that red sand, and that drill sergeant said, "You're going to go get your weapon, your M16." I thought, wait a minute, I thought I was supposed to be helping people. That's how naive I was at 17. It's laughable, but it is. I think the reality of military service and what it is to be a Black person and also a woman, people should know about.
Well, we know now that Tim Walz carried a weapon. I mean, that was
yes, and he still does.
Very controversial for a few minutes and so forth. Do you think that, getting back to the presidential race for a moment, sneaky segue there, but do you think that he's really going to help her campaign? Because, what's coming back from the right is that he's leftist, and he's more San Francisco politics and that kind of thing that we're hearing?
They're both making him San Francisco politics and trying to compare him to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
It's really
Well,
funny because he's not Bernie Sanders. He really is really so. It's Tim Walz is a he doesn't really have he's peerless. You know what I mean? He's very unusual. When his
he's what I would
financials
call
came
sui
back,
generis. He's very
yes.
distinct and unique in so many ways.
One of the things is he doesn't have wealth. He's very unusual. You have people who are governors and in Congress, or these people are rich. He's not. He is basically owns no stock. He has no real estate. Lives in the governor's mansion, I guess, until his time is done. Sold his last house for $350,000. He's middle class.
He's a coach.
He's a coach.
A coach and a teacher, and it's
You know,
smart of Kamala to could refer to him as coach. In fact,
as coach, and I think here's why I think it was a really smart choice for Kamala Harris. One is that you get a guy, they're actually 6 months apart. They're Gen X that can take the hits, and he can do it with a smile, and he's excellent on the campaign trail. He appeals to the part of the base that we really need activated.
well, it's
Not
a
only
base
just
that they have to go against Vance with too, to some extent. To think of the Midwest, Minnesota is really, and he's got a farming background and all that too.
it's very important that Kamala Harris is uniting really a new coalition. People are like, oh, it's Obama. It's not. It's not. It's a different, I think, deeper, more diverse, and stronger coalition. It coalesced in just 3 weeks, and he's a big part of that. I also think that so he can take the hits, and he actually doesn't mind it. The criticism that he did not do his duty after 23 years in the National Guard is laughable. 20 years earns you a retirement. He did more than that.
He had
It's just
like you. He had an
recruiting.
honorable discharge, and he was discharged, as many friends and colleagues of his in the service have said. I mean, they're trying to say that he tried to wend his way out of going to Afghanistan or Iraq, and because he was stationed in Italy, but that was just the luck of the draw, as far as I've been able to determine. We got some more questions here. Actually, another one from Denver that gets us back on track with your work. This is Francis, who wants to know, can you track your focus on empowering women of color to a specific moment or group of moments in your past?
It's funny, we were talking about the military. I'm from California. My first time in the South was boot camp. I mentioned Fort Jackson. And my unit had 200 women, and half were black women. And there were black women from parts of the world I'd never heard about, not the big cities, these remote corners of the South and the Midwest. And I learned both about women in training, like kind of almost like the pushing physical limits, but also I learned in my relationships with people in my unit about economic injustice, about racial injustice. I learned what it was because they are living those lives. We were living those lives. And that was, I think, my first experience telling each other about their lives. And it wasn't until, I think, later on where I started political activism. In California, we had Prop 187, which was a state proposition. When was that? Back in the 90s?
In the 90s, yeah.
Yeah. That kind of like was Trump policy before Trump was trying to take away public access to public education and public health services.
Pete Wilson's doing, really. He was governor at the time.
Governor at the time. And I was a high school teacher in Redwood City, and I taught in the bilingual department. So most of my kids were immigrants from Mexico, one region of Mexico, actually, Michoacan. And it was the girls in my class that I started organizing with. And then they brought their moms into the mix. And I found that not only were these young leaders organizing their families against this draconian statewide measure, but that my capacity to be able to reach, I told you I'm not Latina, I'm not Mexican American, but for me to be in deep solidarity with my students in the community, through the leadership of the girls and women in Redwood City, was another step along the way. So when I finally, many years later, became president of a political action committee called Power Pack with Steve Phillips, who was a friend and colleague from Stanford, also our Jesse Jackson days, students for Jesse Jackson when he ran. Anyway, when we started doing that and meeting Stacey Abrams, before she ran for governor, Stacey Abrams, who was this brilliant strategist who had this idea of remaking democracy and building this multiracial, engaged organizing force. It was just, my career, I think, crystallized so that the work that I've been doing since then and also my experiences in the past all made sense.
Well, you've had, extraordinary number of careers really, and have built quite a really amazing sense of experience and wisdom through the years, and prompts me to ask you maybe one of the more difficult questions I'm going to ask you, and that is, we talk about patriarchy and we talk about misogyny, and the two are clearly linked, and they go on, and sometimes they seem to go on in ways that are even exacerbated or worse than were anticipated. What do you say in terms of all your experience and all your fighting those kind of devils about the work and what really needs to be done, what has to be done?
I think if we look at these systems which predate us and live on in our experience and our culture, some ways we see them, they're obvious, and some ways they're invisible, but they affect us. If we are able to see our lifetime as we have a window of time in order to break the cycles, break the chains, but that we also have a limited time while we're here in order to make things better for the generations that are coming behind us. And certainly that's the lesson I've learned. And at this point in my career, I encourage younger women who feel frustrated by the system to say, look, remember Sojourner Truth, and remember what I call our godmothers who came before us, and how they did their part while they were around to open up space. We're not guaranteed anything, but open up more space, add more love, and through our words and our deeds, we can create more possibilities for the next generation. And when we lose an election, when we hear an unfair attack, we're dehumanized, we're dismissed, we're, someone calls us out of our name, remember the proud tradition that you are from and claim that and keep going.
And believe in democracy, I think you're saying too. But also what you're saying resonates in another way. I just finished reading Nancy Pelosi's book because I'm going to be interviewing her next week at a live event, and hope we can arrange to do a podcast with her as well. But she says, the children, you have to always think of the children, the next generation. And Harris is smart enough to be building a campaign on the future and saying, this is how we distinguish ourselves from the others who are identified with the past. There's a difficult question in many ways that I'm going to go to next. Reed in Santa Rosa wants to know, how do you think a President Harris will tackle immigration? Can she bring humanity and compassion to the issue?
I really think that's what the movement requires. And I do, there's elected office, so my hope and faith is that she will do better than her predecessors, both Democrat and Republican. The child and family separation policy was evil. And she's said a lot to that effect, where we had to find another way. That, you know, you can't call whole swaths of people illegal. You have to support the basic humanity of people. So my hope is that her administration will find a way that even Obama didn't find, okay? And will give people a path to citizenship, which still to this day doesn't fully exist. She's going to need a few things. One is she's going to have to listen, still stay listening to the movement. There's a lot of leaders around reform, immigration reform, that have good ideas that haven't been put into policy. That's number one. Number two, she's going to need a Congress that can pass legislation she can sign. And so that means, like here in California, we have 5 Republican-controlled House districts. And California is very important in this election, and for people who are keeping track. It's not just getting Kamala Harris elected as president, but making sure that the Democrats have the majority in Congress. That is not a guarantee of success, but that creates a conditions in which she can be successful having a course correction on immigration reform.
Can you give us your sense of what has gone on and transformed in America when 70 million people, for example, in the last presidential election cast their vote for Donald Trump?
There's a wonderful academic out of the Institute of Politics at Harvard who describes the national or the global movement to the kind of anti-democratic movement. It's not just happening in the U.S., it's happening in countries across the globe. And it's an authoritarian movement. It's deeply patriarchal. And it can flourish more successfully when they diminish the power of women-led movements. So we saw the connection of all of that. And I think the people who, despite Trump's record of chaos and his criminality, will support that, I think, because they deeply, deeply are authoritarian and fascistic in their beliefs. And there's a lot of ways that they got there. Maybe they want a different, an older version of America and things like that. Maybe they want their group to be ahead of the line all the time and things like that. But a totalitarian or the fascist ideology is what we're fighting against.
Is it also maybe some fear of, I'm thinking about Stokely Carmichael, Black Power. Well, that's what She the People has been all about, is more power for people of color. And that power for people of color, in many people's minds, supplants the power that they had, their status quo.
That's the beauty of someone like Tim Walz. It's like the future for white people doesn't have to be that they will be treated the way that historically white people treated people of color. It doesn't have to be that way. We could create a multiracial democracy in which white people, as well as everybody else, is in the mix. We're all equal members of society, and we're all citizens. And that's a much more optimistic possibility for the future of America, which is a multiracial nation. And yeah, there's that fear. I've heard it from people in my own family. But that's not the only possible future. There's something far more beautiful, powerful, and lasting. I think that we're at the precipice, almost a new political era I think this election could help make possible.
Well, the hope is there, and it's always fascinating to hear your thoughts, and I'm grateful to have had you with us. Before I say adieu, I want to thank all who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. That will not be the case next Friday, but generally you can count on it. You can also count on hearing us on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, I invite you to join simply by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And I also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And let's thank our team, Michael Krasny, Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. And a special thanks to this week's guest, Amiee Allison. I'm Michael Krasny.